In 1812, the young United States declared war on the mighty British Empire, seeking to defend its sovereignty, its sailors, and its pride. What followed was a brutal, chaotic conflict fought on land and sea. From the Canadian wilderness to the burning of Washington, D.C., the British stormed the capital and set the White House ablaze, while American forces clashed with native nations and royal troops in a struggle for control of the continent. Yet in the chaos, legends were born, from Andrew Jackson's defiant stand at New Orleans to the words that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a war neither side truly won, but one that defined the identity of a nation and proved that America would not be so easily broken. But before we continue, I'd like you to take a moment and let me know, where are you watching from? What time is it for you? And are you listening to fall asleep or just passing the time while learning a bit of history? And if you enjoy the stories I tell, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me keep making content like this, and I truly appreciate your support. One more thing before we begin. How do you feel about the crackling sound in the background? Does it help you relax? Or would the videos be better without? Let me know in the comments. And now, let's begin. It's strange, isn't it? How some wars carve their names into stone, while others fade quietly into the background like old wallpaper. You grow up hearing about Lexington and Gettysburg, Normandy and Vietnam. But the War of 1812, that one tends to slip between the cracks. And yet, if you look closer, there's something there, a quiet hinge in history, creaking open. A conflict that changed the course of nations, forged identities, and left behind songs, scars, and shadows. It was a war sparked not by a single outrage, but by a slow burn of slights, economic wounds, and bruised pride. A war where the capital of a young nation would be set ablaze, where native warriors fought for the last chance to preserve their homelands, and where a poem scribbled in a moment of desperation would become a national anthem. But before cannons roared over Baltimore, before the Redcoats marched into Washington, before Andrew Jackson faced down British regulars in a swamp, we have to go back to the uneasy silence after the American Revolution, to Atlantic waters prowled by frigates, to trade routes clogged with politics and powder. That's where the story truly begins. When the Treaty of Paris ended the Revolutionary War in 1783, it was a peace signed with ink, but not with trust. The United States was a republic in its infancy, still wobbling on uncertain legs. Britain, meanwhile, may have ceded political control of its former colonies, but it never fully let go of its grip, especially not on the seas. Maritime dominance was Britain's lifeblood, and it flowed straight through American trade routes. Throughout the 1790s and early 1800s, the Atlantic became a minefield. American merchants tried to remain neutral, doing business with both Britain and France as they warred across Europe in the Napoleonic conflicts. But neutrality only works when both sides agree to respect it, and neither side did. British ships, with the Union Jack snapping in the wind, routinely stopped American vessels and impressed their sailors, claiming, often falsely, that they were British deserters. Imagine being a sailor, born in Boston or Baltimore, dragged off your ship and pressed into service aboard a Royal Navy frigate. That's not just a legal quibble, that's a kidnapping, an erasure of citizenship. And it was happening by the thousands. Then came the Chesapeake Leaper affair in 1807. A quiet afternoon off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia turned into a flashpoint. The British warship HMS Leopard demanded to board the USS Chesapeake. When the Americans refused, the British opened fire, killing 3 and wounding 18. The American ship was boarded. Sailors were seized. The public outcry was instant and furious. President Thomas Jefferson responded with what he hoped would be a bloodless weapon, the Embargo Act of 1807. The idea was to choke off trade, to punish Britain and France by refusing to export American goods until they respected American neutrality. But instead, the embargo punished American merchants and farmers far more severely. Ports went quiet, ships rotted at anchor. The economy stumbled, people grumbled, and across the Atlantic, Britain barely flinched. After all, they were busy fighting Napoleon. The war in Europe consumed nearly all their attention. To London, America was a noisy irritant, not a real threat. So the impressment continued. The blockades grew tighter, and a sense of outrage, not just political but deeply personal, started to fester in the United States. In Washington, voices began to rise. Young members of Congress, full of fire and ambition, began demanding more than diplomatic notes. They spoke of honor, sovereignty, and retaliation. A new generation of politicians had come of age after the revolution. They had inherited a country, but not yet proven they could defend it. The humiliations on the sea were more than provocations. To them, they were tests. And if the nation failed to stand up now, what would it stand for at all? At the same time, settlers were pushing deeper into the Northwest Territory, clashing violently with indigenous nations, who, in turn, were finding allies in the British across the border in Canada. There was a growing suspicion, and some evidence, but Britain was encouraging native resistance, supplying arms, stirring rebellion. So the grievances were piling up. British interference in trade, the seizure of ships, the impressment of sailors, the rumoured support for native uprisings. Each one might not have led to war alone, but together they built a case that could not be ignored, or so the warhawks would soon argue. Still, not everyone agreed that war was the answer. Many in New England, whose ports suffered most under the embargo, feared what conflict would do to their livelihoods. The country wasn't ready, they said. The army was small, the navy smaller still. The treasury was stretched thin. Britain was a superpower. Were these hot-headed young congressmen willing to risk everything on a principle? But principles can be heavy things, especially when wrapped in flags and honor. By 1811, James Madison had replaced Jefferson in the White House. Quiet, scholarly, cautious, Madison was no warmonger by instinct, but the pressure was mounting. Every insult that went unanswered made the president look weaker. Every ship boarded, every sailor taken, became a mark against American independence. And as British policies continued with no change in sight, even doves began to murmur about war. There's a moment in history when inevitability becomes momentum, when the slow dance of diplomacy breaks into a march toward battle. By early 1812, that moment had arrived. They had not yet declared war, but the winds were shifting. In Congress, in the streets, in every letter home from a sailor missing at sea, or a trader locked out of port. And soon, from the floor of the Capitol to the shores of Lake Erie, the war hawks would rise, and the drums would begin. The ocean winds never really stopped, not even after the gunpowder settled from the Revolution. Out at sea, the world remained unsettled. British ships prowled the Atlantic like wolves circling a campfire, watching the young United States with suspicion and, at times, contempt. American sailors, many of them barely out of their teens, found themselves snatched from the decks of merchant vessels by Royal Navy press gangs. The term for it was impressment, a clinical word for what was essentially kidnapping. A British officer would board an American ship, line up the crew, and declare that some of them were, in fact, British subjects, often without any proof. Then, just like that, they were gone, taken, forced to serve on British warships in their war against Napoleon. It happened again and again. Some of the seized men were truly British deserters, yes, but many were American citizens. And Washington protested, repeatedly, but London rarely answered. They were busy fighting for their own survival across the Atlantic, locked in a brutal conflict with France that consumed their attention and dictated their policies. One flashpoint stands out, burned into the memory of every American port town, the Chesapeake Leopard affair in June of 1807. The USS Chesapeake was a proud American frigate, not even prepared for battle, when the HMS Leopard, a British warship, demanded to search her for deserters. When the Chesapeake's captain refused, the Leopard opened fire. 3 Americans were killed, 18 wounded, and 4 sailors were taken, only one of them later proven to be British. It was a national insult. People were outraged, but war didn't come, not yet. President Jefferson responded not with guns, but with paperwork. He tried to starve the problem instead. The Embargo Act of 1807 was meant to be a kind of economic cudgel, a ban on American ships trading with foreign ports. The idea was simple in theory: cut off the flow of goods, and Britain and France would come to the negotiating table. But reality, as it often does, had other plans. American merchants were the ones who suffered. Coastal towns from New England to the Carolinas watched their economies choke. Ships sat idle in harbors. Warehouses overflowed with unsold goods. Sailors found themselves unemployed, milling around docks with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The embargo hit hardest in the very places that had once thrived on global trade. It's hard not to feel the quiet desperation of those years. The United States was still young, still figuring itself out, and now caught between two empires tearing at each other's throats. Napoleon's France and Britain's Royal Navy both viewed neutral shipping as fair game. American cargo was seized by both sides, though Britain's violations felt more personal. Their navy controlled the seas, and with that power came arrogance. In some ways, the war was creeping in long before anyone declared it. Along the western frontier, tensions simmered between settlers and indigenous nations. In the halls of Congress, voices grew louder, angrier. But in the taverns in towns, regular people felt a more subtle pressure. Their sons were being taken, their ships were being stopped, and the promise of independence, so recently won, felt increasingly hollow. President Jefferson stepped down in 1809, leaving the situation for his successor, James Madison. A brilliant man, shy and soft-spoken, Madison lacked the commanding presence of his predecessor, but he understood the stakes. His presidency would be defined not by what he built, but by what he had to protect: American sovereignty, fragile and under siege. In the years leading up to 1812, Congress passed a series of acts trying to tweak the strategy: the Non-Intercourse Act, Macon's Bill No. 2, all designed to punish Britain and France economically. Each one was more desperate than the last, and none of them worked. Britain's navy kept blocking American ports, kept seizing ships, and kept dragging off sailors with barely an apology. Then there was the issue of honor. It's hard to grasp now, in an age of treaties and international courts, but in 1812, a nation's reputation mattered immensely. A single insult, if unanswered, could haunt a presidency. And to many Americans, especially the younger, more nationalistic voices rising in the South and West, British actions weren't just practical obstacles, they were humiliations. Insults to the flag, to the country, to everything the revolution had promised. Behind it all loomed the shadow of Britain's war with France. Napoleon had redrawn the map of Europe, and the British were fighting tooth and nail to contain him. To the British Admiralty, America was a minor nuisance, not a true neutral. And honestly, there was some truth to that. American merchants sometimes skirted the rules, selling goods to France and helping to fuel the Continental War effort. But Britain's response was wildly disproportionate. Their blockade of European ports, and their orders in council, trade restrictions issued without warning, strangled American commerce almost entirely. By 1811, war felt less like a choice and more like a tide rising too fast to outrun. In December of that year, the British sloop Little Belt had a skirmish with the USS President. Guns were fired. More men were killed. Tensions inched closer to the edge. And then there were the whispers, the ones that curled like smoke around the edges of every debate. Whispers that the British were arming indigenous warriors in the Northwest, fueling resistance, inciting attacks on American settlements. Whether or not it was fully true didn't seem to matter. Enough believed it. Enough had buried loved ones on the frontier. It added one more log to a growing fire. Looking back, it's hard not to feel the inevitability. The war drums were beating, loud enough now that even those who had tried to ignore them, the merchants, the moderates, the coastal elites, were forced to listen. Still, it's worth pausing here, just briefly, to reflect on how complex these tensions really were. This wasn't a war sparked by a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of insults and grievances, a tangled mess of pride, policy, and poor communication. And at the center of it, a nation still unsure of its place in the world, still trying to prove that it could defend its own. There's something strangely human about that. A young country, like a young person, demanding to be taken seriously, even if it means standing up to a much larger, more dangerous rival, maybe especially then. And so, by the time 1812 arrived, the table was set. Diplomacy had failed, compromises had run dry, and in the smoke-filled chambers of Congress, the voices calling for war were no longer whispers, they were thunder. The vote came down on June 18, 1812. Congress declared war against Great Britain, the first time in its short history that the United States had formally done so. And yet, the mood across the country was anything but unified. While the ink was drying on President James Madison's signature, fireworks and cheers erupted in places like Kentucky and Tennessee. But in New England towns, church bells tolled not in celebration, but in mourning. It's strange to think that a nation could step into war so unsure of itself. The vote in the House of Representatives had passed 79 to 59, and in the Senate, it scraped by with just 19 votes to 13. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. The debate had been fierce, emotional, and deeply divided along regional lines. And it wasn't just about impressment or British trade blockades anymore. There was something much more complicated underneath the surface. At the heart of the push for war stood a group of young, fervent politicians known as the War Hawks. They were mostly from the South and the frontier West, names that would soon become pillars of American political history. Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Felix Grundy of Tennessee. These men were brash, idealistic, and eager to assert the dignity of the United States on the world stage. Clay, just 34 years old when he became Speaker of the House, believed war was essential, not just for national honor, but for territorial expansion. He dreamed of annexing Canada, and possibly even Spanish-held Florida. The conquest of Canada, he once claimed, is a mere matter of marching. There was this widespread belief, or perhaps delusion, that Canadians were just waiting to be liberated by their Republican neighbors. But if the War Hawks were loud and persuasive, their opposition was no less passionate. The Federalists, concentrated in the commercial hubs of the Northeast, had no appetite for war. They saw it as an economic disaster and a strategic folly. British trade was the lifeblood of ports like Boston, New Haven, and Providence. Cutting it off would choke commerce, bankrupt merchants, and send shipyards into silence. In fact, some New Englanders viewed the war as not just unwise, but borderline treasonous. Timothy Pickering, a Federalist senator from Massachusetts, openly floated the idea of secession if the war damaged his region's economy beyond repair. The seeds of disunion were there, small and bitter, long before the Civil War would make them grow. What fascinates me, though, is how much of this conflict was being driven by pride, by perception. The United States was a young republic, barely 35 years old, still trying to prove that it deserved a seat at the table of great powers. Every time a British warship stopped an American merchant vessel, or pressed a sailor into service, it wasn't just a violation of law, it was a personal insult to the nation's dignity. Madison himself was not a warlike man. Quiet, bookish, and deeply principled, he had hoped to avoid armed conflict altogether, but he was increasingly hemmed in by the pressures of his party, the War Hawks in Congress, and a rising tide of public indignation. The final straw was Britain's continued refusal to lift its trade restrictions or cease the impressment of American sailors, even after months of negotiation. Madison submitted his war message to Congress on June 1, 1812. The message stopped short of outright recommending war, but its tone was unmistakable. Behind the scenes, the American military was nowhere near ready. The army had just around 12,000 regular troops. Many were poorly trained, scattered across vast distances, and led by aging Revolutionary War veterans no longer suited for modern command. There was no standing navy worthy of the name, just a handful of frigates and sloops, brave but overmatched by the vast British fleet. One officer who would soon become a central figure, Winfield Scott, recalled in his memoirs that when he first inspected his men, he found soldiers without boots, uniforms held together with string, and supplies that hadn't arrived in weeks. "We were not ready for war," he wrote. "We were scarcely ready for a parade." Despite all this, there was a sense among many Americans, especially on the frontier, that war was not just necessary, it was inevitable. Reports of British agents arming indigenous nations in the Northwest Territories, whispers of conspiracy, and the memory of British occupation in the Revolution stirred old fears. It was not hard to stoke patriotic fervour when stories of native raids, allegedly inspired by British encouragement, were circulated in border towns. But beneath the noise and speeches and editorials, I often wonder how the average American felt about all this. The farmer in upstate New York, hearing the rumble of distant drums. The dock worker in Boston watching cargo ships vanish from the harbor. The young soldier, signing up not for glory, but for a steady wage and a promise of land. There's something eerie about the quiet before a war like this. No grand mobilization, no swelling music, just a growing sense that something irreversible had begun. And then, across the northern border, came the first orders for invasion. Without a professional army to rely on, the United States turned to its state militias. Men from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky were called into service. Some came willingly, fired up by speeches and songs. Others were dragged in by local draft boards. Most had never fired a musket in anger, let alone marched hundreds of miles through swamp and forest. General William Hull was chosen to lead the first major offensive, a campaign to seize Fort Detroit and strike into Upper Canada. A Revolutionary War veteran and governor of Michigan Territory, Hull was in his late 50s and not in the best shape, either physically or mentally. He crossed into Canada in July of 1812 with about 2,000 men. Morale was already fraying, supplies were low, and he quickly discovered that the Canadians weren't quite the eager revolutionaries the Warhawks had imagined. We'll get there soon, the moment where that campaign unravels, where the war shifts from theory to hard reality. But here, at this precise point in the story, we find a nation still suspended in a kind of strange limbo, united in declaration, divided in purpose, filled with hope and yet burdened by naivete. The war had begun, but few truly understood what was coming. The air was thick with hope and delusion as American soldiers crossed into Canada in the summer of 1812. There was this bold, almost naive confidence pulsing through the ranks. The belief that the Canadians, many of them recent immigrants from the United States, would welcome liberation with open arms. Some even imagined the conquest of Canada as a mere formality, a brief march followed by cheering townsfolk and a tidy annexation. But the reality was colder, harsher, and far more complicated. The first major blow came in Detroit. General William Hull, a Revolutionary War veteran, was appointed to lead the Northwestern Army across the Detroit River into Upper Canada. He was 60 years old, stiff with nerves and indecision. His troops were poorly trained militia, many still boys by any modern standard. When he did march into Canada in July, he hesitated, delayed, and then, with British forces gathering and his supply lines threatened, panicked. British Major General Isaac Brock, stationed in Upper Canada, knew exactly how to exploit this fear. With fewer troops and far less firepower, he pulled off a masterstroke. Brock partnered with the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, whose warriors had been harassing American supply routes and spreading fear along the frontier. Together, they staged a campaign of psychological warfare, parading their forces to appear larger, sending intercepted messages suggesting thousands more Indigenous warriors were waiting in ambush. Hull folded without a fight. On August 16th, 1812, he surrendered Fort Detroit and all its men, over 2,000 soldiers, to a force about half that size. It was, frankly, humiliating. One American officer called it the most shameful chapter in the annals of American arms. Hull was later court-martialed and sentenced to death for cowardice, though President Madison pardoned him in recognition of his service in the Revolution. Still, the damage to morale was done, and the invasion plans didn't get much better from there. Later that fall, a fresh attempt was made to cross the Niagara River at Queenston Heights. American forces under General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a political appointee with little military experience, tried to seize a foothold on the Canadian side. Again, things spiraled quickly. Poor coordination, untrained troops, and a failure to reinforce the landing party led to chaos. British and Canadian forces, including local militia and Mohawk warriors, counterattacked fiercely. It was here that Isaac Brock met his end. He rushed into the fray without waiting for backup and was shot in the chest while rallying his men. But even in death, Brock's legacy only grew. He became a Canadian folk hero, a symbol of resistance, courage, and loyalty to the Crown. His statue still overlooks the Niagara River today. The Americans, meanwhile, suffered another bloody defeat. Troops on the US side of the river refused to cross and support their comrades, watching from the safety of New York as the Canadian counterattack unfolded. The wounded and cornered Americans on the far bank were overwhelmed and forced to surrender. It was a pattern that would repeat again and again. Bold plans collapsing under poor leadership, lack of discipline, and underestimation of Canadian resolve. Stony Creek, Beaver Dams, Crystal's Farm, each one a testament to how deeply the American command had misjudged the terrain, the people, and the stakes. They weren't marching into a passive colony. They were storming into a defensive homeland, one defended not just by British redcoats, but by militia, loyalists, and crucially, Indigenous allies, with far more at stake than colonial pride. One of the most quietly powerful figures in the story was Laura Secord, a Canadian woman whose name would eventually grace a line of chocolates, but her real-life heroism was far more meaningful. In June 1813, she overheard American officers talking about a surprise attack on a British outpost at Beaver Dams. Her husband was recovering from wounds sustained earlier in the war. With him unable to act, Laura set out on foot, walking 20 miles through dense forest and rough terrain, past American patrols to warn the British. Thanks to her warning, the defenders, led by a small group of British regulars and about 400 Mohawk warriors, were able to ambush and defeat the American force. The entire unit surrendered. The event was minor in terms of numbers, but massive symbolically. It showed that the defenders of Canada, in all their diverse forms, were capable of more than just surviving. They were adapting, communicating, resisting. There was something else brewing beneath the surface too. In places like York, present-day Toronto, civilians were witnessing the war up close. In April 1813, American forces landed and attacked the town, torching public buildings and looting homes. It was an ugly, chaotic episode, and one that hardened Canadian attitudes against the invasion. The Americans burned the Parliament building and accidentally set off a powder magazine explosion that killed dozens, including American soldiers caught in the blast. The British would later return the favour, of course, when they torched Washington, D.C. in 1814. But in York, the seeds of a distinct Canadian identity were already taking root, not as Americans with a different flag, but as people defending their land from aggression. It's easy, in hindsight, to see how arrogant the American assumptions were. They thought of themselves as liberators, but they had little understanding of the people they were invading. Many settlers in Canada had fled the US during the Revolution because they had remained loyal to Britain. Others were just trying to survive, caught between empire and rebellion. Few saw American soldiers as saviors. Fewer still wanted to be annexed. And then, in the thick of all this, were the Indigenous nations, who knew this war wasn't just about flags or trade routes. For them, the American invasions meant another wave of land loss, another betrayal, another step toward disappearance. So they fought with everything they had, not just as allies of Britain, but as defenders of their own nations. Looking back, what strikes me most is how misguided the invasion was, not just tactically, but morally. There was this assumption that the arc of history would bend toward American expansion, that the continent was just waiting to be claimed. But history doesn't bend so easily. People resist. Landscapes resist. And sometimes, the myths of destiny crack under the weight of reality. The invasions of Canada were supposed to be the opening act of a swift and glorious campaign. Instead, they became a series of costly reminders that war, even when cloaked in the language of liberation, is never simple. And as 1813 wore on, with American troops stalled along the northern border and morale running low, attention began to shift, away from the forests of Ontario and toward the river valleys of the Midwest, where a different kind of war was being fought. One led not by presidents or generals, but by a man who spoke of unity, of resistance, and of a dream stitched together from the ashes of broken treaties. His name was Tecumseh, and his war was just beginning. The camps were quiet in the early morning fog, the ground damp beneath moccasined feet, and the smell of wood smoke lingering like a memory. This was a different war than the one imagined in Washington or London. For the native nations of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, it was not about honor or trade routes. It was about land, about life. And in the smoky shadows of the frontier, one voice had risen above the rest, clear and commanding. Tecumseh. He was not a man easily forgotten. Tall, with fierce eyes and the quiet force of a prophet, Tecumseh was more than just a Shawnee leader. He was a visionary, a strategist, and in many ways, a last hope. He spoke of unity, of a pan-Indigenous confederacy that would transcend tribal lines. In a world carved up by treaties they never signed, he imagined the resistance rooted not in desperation, but in dignity. Tecumseh had spent years warning his people, and others, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Delaware, that American encroachment would never stop unless they made it stop. He'd seen village after village burned in Kentucky and Ohio, seen promises broken and hunting grounds swallowed by hungry borders. And so he preached something dangerous for the time, a common indigenous identity, a united front. His brother, known as Tenskwatawa, the prophet, brought a spiritual fire to the movement. After falling into a trance during a period of personal failure, he awoke with visions and began preaching a return to traditional ways. Reject alcohol, cast off European goods, restore the old ways. That was his call. And somehow it worked. People listened. Settlements like Prophetstown near the Tippecanoe River became symbols of renewal and resistance. But by 1811, the Americans had noticed. Indiana Territory's governor, William Henry Harrison, a veteran Indian fighter, saw this spiritual political movement as a threat. In November of that year, while Tecumseh was away recruiting allies in the South, Harrison launched an attack on Prophetstown. The resulting clash, the Battle of Tippecanoe, was bloody and inconclusive, yet it burned the prophet's village to the ground and helped ignite the fuse of full war. When war officially broke out in 1812, Tecumseh saw an opportunity, perhaps the last. He aligned with the British, though not out of loyalty to the crown. He knew well enough that Britain had its own ambitions. But unlike the Americans, the British had at least shown willingness to support a native buffer state between the US and Canada. It wasn't trust, it was strategy. In those early months, Tecumseh proved invaluable. At the siege of Detroit, he and a few hundred warriors created the illusion of a much larger force by repeatedly marching past the same vantage point in different clothing and formations. The psychological trick helped British General Isaac Brock secure a bloodless American surrender, a humiliation for the United States. Even Brock admitted, a more sagacious or gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. But every success was shadowed by uncertainty. The British, often cautious and cold in their dealings with native allies, gave promises they couldn't always keep. As the war dragged into 1813, supplies ran thin. The Americans, after defeats in Canada, began to regroup and push back. The turning point came in the fall of that year, in a marshy stretch of Ontario near the Thames River. American forces, led by General William Henry Harrison, the same man who had burned Prophetstown, pursued retreating British and native forces after the US victory at the Battle of Lake Erie. The British, demoralized and outnumbered, abandoned their position. Tecumseh and his warriors were left to make a final stand alone. It was there, on October 5, 1813, that Tecumseh fell in battle. No one knows exactly how he died. The American accounts are contradictory, laced with self-congratulation and myth. Some claim he was killed by Colonel Richard Johnson, a future vice president. Others suggest it was chaos, smoke, and confusion that brought him down. A musket ball to the chest or leg, a saber through the ribs. The truth, lost in the frenzy, has been replaced by legend. His body was never clearly identified. His followers, it is said, carried it away into the forest and buried it in a secret place, so that no white man would ever stand over him in victory. With his death, something more than a man was lost. The idea of an indigenous confederacy, independent, strong, and self-governing, began to fade. His coalition fractured. The British, without Tecumseh to anchor the alliance, shifted their priorities. And the Americans, sensing weakness, surged forward. It's difficult to explain just how much Tecumseh meant to the people who followed him. He wasn't just a war leader, he was a symbol A North American Spartacus, some have called him, not because he sought empire, but because he challenged one. In his lifetime, he resisted not only armies but the tide of empire itself. And yet, in many history books, he's little more than a paragraph, sometimes a footnote. It's strange, isn't it, how the people who fought hardest to protect their homeland are often the ones left out of its story. But his words survive. Sell a country, he once said. Why not sell the air, the clouds, the great sea? There's a kind of timelessness in that line, as if he was speaking not only to his generation but to ours. You can feel the weight of it if you sit with it long enough. After Tecumseh's fall, native resistance in the Midwest collapsed rapidly. Many tribes, seeing the writing on the wall, signed treaties they didn't want and moved west. Some tried to hold on. Most were pushed aside by what was now becoming policy: Indian removal. The war had given the US government justification for expansion, and there would be no turning back. By the end of 1813, the war still had a year and a half to go. Battles would rage on land and sea. Cities would burn. But something vital had already changed. One of the fiercest hopes for a native future had been extinguished, and the land, once crisscrossed by trade routes and hunting trails, began to echo with the sound of wagons, settlers, and surveyors. Sometimes, in telling these stories late at night, I wonder what Tecumseh would say if he could walk the Ohio River today. Would he recognize anything? Would he still hear the whisper of drums in the forest? Would he smile, or would he mourn? We move forward now, leaving behind the bloodied soil of the Thames, and following the echoes of cannons to the coastlines. Because while the war on land faltered and turned, another struggle had taken shape on the open sea, a place where wooden giants clashed and victory rode on the wind. The sea has always been a realm of uncertainty, unpredictable and unknowable. It reflects the mood of the nations that sail upon it. And, in the War of 1812, it was on the open water where pride was wounded, legends were born, and the limits of ambition were sharply defined. At the war's outset, the United States Navy was barely a shadow compared to the British Royal Navy, which then ruled the oceans with over 500 ships. The Americans, by contrast, had fewer than 20 seaworthy vessels. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for with daring captains, solid ship design, and an underdog's tenacity. Take the USS Constitution, for instance, affectionately nicknamed Old Ironsides. Launched back in 1797, it was already a respected frigate before war broke out. But in August 1812, she carved her name into legend. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, under the command of Captain Isaac Hull, Constitution engaged the British frigate HMS Guerriere. The two ships exchanged broadsides in a thunderous ballet of smoke and fire. Witnesses reported that British cannonballs seemed to bounce off the sides of the American ship, hence the nickname. When the Guerriere was reduced to a splintered wreck, Hull took her as a prize, and American morale surged. I've always found something quietly powerful about that. The idea of a wooden ship earning near mythic status, not because it was invincible, but because it stood firm when it mattered most. The early months of the war saw several more American naval victories that seemed to defy logic. In October 1812, the USS United States captured HMS Macedonian, another dramatic duel that ended with a British surrender, and a captured ship proudly paraded into an American port. Then, in December, the USS Constitution struck again, this time defeating HMS Java off the coast of Brazil. That battle was so fierce that Java was destroyed beyond repair and had to be burned at sea. But as inspiring as these victories were, they were isolated flashes in a much larger and more brutal picture. The British Navy, after all, was not idle. While many of its best ships and men were still tied up fighting Napoleon in Europe, the blockades around American ports grew tighter with each passing month. By 1813, Britain had established a near-complete blockade of the American coastline. The economic impact was severe. American merchants were strangled, coastal cities choked under trade restrictions, and naval supplies dwindled. Shipyards could no longer get the timber and pitch they needed. Salt, a vital preservative, became scarce. In some regions, inflation quietly crept upward, and food imports fell to a trickle. It wasn't just about ships firing at each other. It was a quiet war of attrition, waged with hunger and silence. Still, inland waters told a different story. Control of the Great Lakes became vital, especially in the west, where movement of troops and supplies depended heavily on water routes. In the summer of 1813, the American Navy, under the leadership of Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, prepared for a showdown on Lake Erie. Perry, a young and determined officer, oversaw the construction of a small fleet at Erie, Pennsylvania. They were built fast, sometimes with green wood, and often under threat of British attack. On September 10, 1813, Perry engaged the British squadron in what became the Battle of Lake Erie. Early in the fight, Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, was shredded under heavy fire. Refusing to surrender, Perry took his battle flag, emblazoned with the words, "Don't give up the ship," and transferred to the relatively undamaged Niagara, rowing across open water through cannon shot and spray. From there, he resumed command and broke through the British line, forcing their surrender. In a dispatch written to General William Henry Harrison, Perry famously wrote, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." That phrase would echo through the century, a line of grit and triumph, scribbled in haste after hours of brutal fighting. That victory gave the United States control of Lake Erie and forced British forces to retreat from Detroit. It also allowed General Harrison to pursue the British and Tecumseh's allied forces into Ontario, leading eventually to the Battle of the Thames. But we've already touched on that turning point and the death that came with it. What's interesting, though, is how the war on water slowly shifted tone. The early bravado of ship-to-ship duels faded into the long grind of coastal defense. British raids became more frequent, and their dominance on the seas made American commercial sailing nearly impossible. The eastern seaboard became vulnerable, with towns like New London, Connecticut, and Norfolk, Virginia, under constant fear of bombardment. Entire fleets were bottled up in port, unable to break through the British lines. Privateers, though, those legalized pirates of the age, offered a strange glimmer of resistance. Over 500 privateer ships were commissioned by the US government during the war. These were privately owned vessels, often fast schooners, armed and authorized to harass British shipping. And they did, capturing or disrupting hundreds of British merchant ships, inflicting real economic damage and sowing chaos across the Atlantic. It's worth noting that the British press often referred to American privateers with contempt, calling them piratical Yankees. Yet many British captains privately acknowledged their skill. Some American privateers, like the Chasseur out of Baltimore, even went so far as to declare blockades of British ports in symbolic retaliation. It was a game of cat and mouse, filled with desperation, but it also served as one of the only ways for Americans to stay active on the seas as the Royal Navy tightened its grip. Meanwhile, inland, the British turned their naval dominance into a tool of psychological warfare. Their ships weren't just for combat anymore. They were floating instruments of intimidation. In 1814, British forces began sailing up rivers, torching towns, and raiding unguarded coasts. People began to fear not just defeat, but humiliation. And that sense of dread would soon come to a head in the capital itself. But before we step onto those burning streets, back in the stillness of the Atlantic, something lingers in my mind. These wooden ships, creaking, groaning against the waves, sails straining in the wind, they carried more than just powder and cannonballs. They carried hope, pride, identity. The men aboard them weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of a young nation trying to prove itself. And sometimes, in the silence between shots, you wonder if they knew, if they felt history curling in around them like smoke. Maybe they did. Maybe that's why they fought so hard, even when the odds were cruel. But let's keep going. There's more to see. It was August of 1814 when the British set their sights on the heart of the young American Republic. The war had dragged on for over 2 years by that point, and while it had brought fierce battles on the seas and in the forests of the Northwest, it was now coming home. Not just to outposts and border towns, but to the capital itself. There's something eerie about imagining the streets of Washington, D.C. on the eve of its greatest crisis. The city was still new, raw in places, with muddy roads and half-finished buildings, more a symbol than a fortress. And yet it had become a target, not just for military strategy, but for humiliation. The British force, Hardened veterans, under the command of Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross, had landed in Maryland with surprising ease. After defeating a cobbled-together American force at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th, they encountered almost no resistance as they marched toward the capital. The battle itself was a rout. American militia fled under heat and pressure, leaving behind cannons and confusion. President James Madison, sensing the gravity of the situation, had already fled on horseback, accompanied by his cabinet and whatever government papers they could carry. And so, the city lay exposed. What followed that day was something Americans had not seen since the Revolution, and haven't seen since. A foreign army occupying and torching their capital. The British didn't just set fire to military targets. They burned the Capitol, the Senate, the House of Representatives. Flames climbed the walls of the White House, then still called the Executive Mansion. Before fleeing, Dolly Madison, already something of a national celebrity, famously rescued Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, cutting it from its frame with the help of a servant and 2 soldiers. That portrait still hangs in the White House today. There's something symbolic in that image, the First Lady refusing to let the face of the revolution burn, as if the young republic needed, in that hour of devastation, to see the face of its founding father one more time, to remember what had been risked and what was still at stake. The fires raged for hours. Red light poured into the night sky. The Library of Congress, just 14 years old, turned to ash. Soldiers destroyed anything they considered part of the American war effort: rope walks, foundries, arsenals. But some buildings were spared. The Patent Office, for instance, was reportedly saved by the intervention of Dr. William Thornton, who convinced British officers that it was a storehouse of human invention, not a weapon of war. Still, the effect was overwhelming. It wasn't just about buildings. It was about dignity. To many Americans, it felt like a message, a reminder that their experiment in government was still vulnerable, fragile, breakable. But oddly enough, that fire sparked something else. A new kind of unity. Because up until then, the war had been unevenly supported. In the North, especially in New England, the war had been bitterly opposed. Many Federalists saw it as a Mr. Madison's war, a foolish and avoidable entanglement. But with Washington in flames, opposition began to melt. It was no longer about whether one supported the war. It was about national survival. The attack didn't end with the capital. British forces soon moved toward Baltimore, hoping for another swift blow. But Baltimore was not Washington. It was defended, determined, and ready to resist. And that's where the story takes us next. But before we leave the capital behind entirely, I keep thinking about how strange it must have felt to return to that city the next morning, with the smoke still rising from its bones. There are accounts of citizens wandering through the charred ruins, stepping carefully between blackened stones and scorched pages. Some people wept, others just stared. There's something about watching your seat of government burned down that leaves a mark far deeper than architecture. Major General Robert Ross, the British commander who oversaw the burning, would later be killed at Baltimore just a few weeks afterward. A single musket ball, they say, fired by an American sniper hidden in the trees near Hampstead Hill. He died in his uniform, still confident that he could take the city. In a way, that's the odd rhythm of this war. It lurches from humiliation to triumph, from disaster to myth-making, sometimes within days. Now, there's a detail I keep coming back to, buried in a letter written by an American eyewitness. He wrote that as the Capitol burned, the night sky turned orange for miles. But in the middle of it all, someone began to ring a church bell. Not for warning, not for evacuation, but as a kind of defiance. A single note, tolling again and again in the thick smoke, as if to say, you can burn the buildings, but not the idea. That, I think, is where this war begins to change. Not in strategy, not yet, but in spirit. Because while the British were confident, even arrogant, after their success at Washington, their next target would surprise them. Fort McHenry would not be so easy, and somewhere on a British ship, during the next great bombardment, a young lawyer, named Francis Scott Key, was about to watch a flag survive a night of fire. But that's still on the horizon. For now, imagine the stillness of that ruined capital. The wind moving through broken columns, the soot on marble, the silence after the flames. The war wasn't over, but something in the American heart had begun to harden. There was resolve now, and resilience. It was no longer just about honor, or territory, or trade. It was about something deeper. The idea that a nation, however new or flawed, had the right to stand its ground, even in smoke, even in shadow, even with the ashes still warm. The night sky hung heavy with smoke and the distant echoes of cannon fire. As the British fleet turned its attention from Washington to Baltimore, a city bristling with defences and a determined population unwilling to surrender. After the crushing humiliation of the burning of the American capital, the nation's spirits were fragile. Yet here in Baltimore, something different was about to unfold. A moment that would quietly ignite a flame of hope, resilience, and enduring symbolism. Baltimore was no stranger to conflict, and its citizens had spent months preparing for the British assault. Fort McHenry, guarding the vital harbour, stood as the sentinel between the invaders and the city beyond. Commanded by Major George Armistead, the fort's defences were reinforced with thousands of men and layered artillery, ready to face a British navy renowned for its power. Unlike the scattered and disorganised defence around Washington, here the Americans had rallied, unified in purpose and resolve. On the night of September 13th, 1814, the British Navy began its bombardment. For 25 relentless hours, Fort McHenry was subjected to a ceaseless rain of rockets and mortar shells, each explosion lighting the sky like distant fireworks, casting eerie shadows over the battered walls. The fort's defenders returned fire steadily, their cannon fire echoing off the water, refusing to yield despite the thunderous assault. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of the bombardment. But Fort McHenry stood firm. Among the spectators was Francis Scott Key, a young lawyer and amateur poet who had boarded a British ship under a flag of truce to negotiate the release of a prisoner. Stranded there during the attack, Key watched anxiously through the night as the fortress withstood wave after wave of attack. As dawn finally broke on September 14th, 1814, his eyes searched the horizon for a sign, a flag waving, still aloft above the battered fort. When the enormous American flag, with its 15 stars and stripes, appeared, Key was overcome with emotion. The sight inspired him to pen a poem titled Defense of Fort Mary, later known as The Star-Spangled Banner. In those verses, he captured not just the sight of the flag, but the spirit of a nation refusing to be extinguished. The words would eventually become the American national anthem, a symbol not only of victory, but of perseverance, hope, and identity. The defense of Fort McHenry marked a critical turning point. While it did not end the war, it revived the faltering American spirit. The people who heard Key's verses, set to music soon after, found new reasons to believe in their young country's capacity to endure and even triumph. It was as if, in that moment, the shadow cast by the burning of Washington was lifted, replaced by the steady glow of determination. But this victory was not just symbolic. The successful defense of Baltimore halted the British advance in the Chesapeake Bay region, frustrating their campaign to cripple the United States by attacking major cities and infrastructure. British commanders realized the Americans were far more resilient and prepared than before. It was a sobering lesson that the war would not be won by quick raids or mere intimidation. Behind the scenes, the war's complex diplomatic dance continued. Negotiators in Ghent, Belgium, were hammering out terms to end the conflict, a war that had stretched far longer than many expected. The battles raging in North America contrasted sharply with the peace talks, where weary diplomats sought to restore calm and order. While no territory changed hands, the negotiations embodied a tacit recognition of mutual exhaustion and a desire to move forward. Yet even with the looming peace, fighting pressed on, fueled by local pride and stubbornness. News travelled slowly, and across the continent, commanders and soldiers fought as if the war would last forever. The defense of Baltimore embodied this mixture of hope and stubbornness, a city refusing to fall, a people refusing to despair. Reflecting on Fort McHenry's bombardment, it's striking to consider how a single moment can capture the imagination and become a cornerstone of national identity. Francis Scott Key's poem did more than celebrate a military defense. It crystallized a narrative about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The Star and Spangled Banner became a metaphor for survival and defiance, not only against an invading force, but against the deeper fears that the young American experiment might unravel. I sometimes wonder, what would it have been like to witness those fiery rockets streaking across the night sky, to feel the earth shaking beneath the fort's walls, and then to see that flag still flying come dawn? It's a powerful image, one that must have resonated deeply with those who feared their world was collapsing, yet found something steadfast to hold on to. There is something profoundly human in that mixture of fear and hope, a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and battles, but lived moments of resilience. While Baltimore celebrated its defense, the British recalibrated their efforts, eventually turning their attention further south toward New Orleans. But for a brief, shining moment, the stubborn stand at Fort McHenry signaled that the American spirit had not been broken. The war was far from over, but neither was the hope for a future defined by determination and unity. In those hours and days after the bombardment, the story of Fort McHenry began to spread. Songs and poems were shared in taverns and parlors, the anthem's stirring refrain carried in the voices of those who dreamed of a stronger nation. It was a victory carved not just in stone and cannon fire, but in the hearts of people. Ordinary men and women who understood that sometimes the greatest battles are fought with quiet courage and steadfast endurance. And so, Baltimore's stand became more than a military success. It became a symbol that whispered to every American, and perhaps even to the world, that even when faced with the darkest nights, a flicker of light could endure, guiding the way forward. That flicker of hope soon faced its greatest test downriver, where the fate of the young nation would be decided, not by bombardments or blockades, but by a fierce and unexpected confrontation. The stage was set on the muddy banks of the Mississippi, where determination and desperation would collide in a battle that would resonate long after the war itself had drawn to a close. The Battle of New Orleans unfolded in the cold light of January 1815, but its echoes stretched far beyond the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. Andrew Jackson, a man shaped by frontier struggles and a fierce sense of personal honor, stood at the center of this defining moment. What makes this battle so fascinating is that it was fought after the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed in December 1814, though news of peace had not yet crossed the Atlantic. It was a clash born from circumstance and miscommunication, but one that carved itself deeply into the American imagination. Jackson was no ordinary general. He commanded a diverse force of regular soldiers, militia, free African Americans, native allies, and even pirates, led by the colorful Jean Lafitte. This motley army stood against a British force of seasoned veterans, fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, a professional military power. Despite this imbalance in experience, Jackson's men held firm, their defenses well prepared and deeply entrenched behind earthworks and natural barriers. The British launched their assault on January 8, 1815, confident that the battle would be a swift victory. Instead, they were met with a wall of fire and discipline, unlike anything they had anticipated. The muddy terrain and cold rain slowed their advance, but it was the ferocity of Jackson's riflemen and artillery that shattered their ranks. British casualties were staggering, over 2,000 dead, wounded, or captured, while American losses numbered fewer than 100. One of the remarkable aspects of this battle was Jackson's ability to unify a fractured group of fighters with different backgrounds and motivations. He famously insisted on discipline, sometimes with harsh measures, but also inspired loyalty by treating his men as equals. The inclusion of Lafitte's pirates, with their knowledge of the local waterways, was an unusual but crucial advantage. Jackson's victory was not simply a military success. It was a statement of identity for a young nation still struggling to find itself. Yet the irony remains that the Treaty of Ghent, which effectively ended the war and restored the status quo, had been signed weeks earlier. News traveled slowly in the early 19th century, and the delay meant that thousands died in a battle that no longer needed to be fought. This disconnect between diplomacy and the reality on the ground adds a bittersweet layer to the story. It's a reminder of the slow pace of communication in that era, and how history can sometimes hinge on the timing of messages. The triumph at New Orleans propelled Andrew Jackson into the national spotlight. His image as a rugged, no-nonsense leader made him a hero to many Americans, especially in the South and West. This victory became a cornerstone of his political career, paving the way for his presidency in 1829. Jackson's brand of populism, forged in the crucible of battle, would go on to shape American politics for decades. Beyond the political rise of Jackson, the battle itself became a symbol of American resilience and determination. For a nation that had suffered early humiliations, from failed invasions to the burning of its capital, New Orleans was a moment of pride and vindication. It helped shift the narrative of the war from one of struggle and near collapse to one of triumph and survival. This victory was celebrated in song, story, and folklore, often glossing over the complex realities of the conflict and its aftermath. However, beneath the surface of celebration lay deeper truths that are sometimes overlooked. The battle, while a tactical success for the United States, did little to alter the broader geopolitical landscape. The war's end meant a return to pre-war borders, with no significant territorial gains. But the consequences for indigenous nations were profound and tragic. Native allies who had fought alongside the British, hoping to secure their lands and sovereignty, found themselves abandoned in the post-war settlements. The death of Tecumseh years earlier had already been a severe blow to indigenous resistance, and the war's conclusion further opened the door for American expansion into native territories. This outcome highlights a recurring theme in American history: the marginalization of indigenous voices amid larger power struggles. While the war is often framed as a contest between Britain and the United States, the indigenous peoples caught in the middle endured profound losses, their aspirations for self-determination crushed beneath the ambitions of expanding nations. I find it compelling to reflect on how this battle, so vivid in American memory, fits into the larger story of the War of 1812. It was a moment when local courage and leadership intersected with global events, producing a lasting legacy. Yet, the very nature of the conflict, fought for honor, trade rights, and national identity, reminds us that history is rarely straightforward. What one side calls a decisive victory, another might see as a costly and avoidable skirmish. Jackson's victory at New Orleans also had cultural repercussions. It fostered a surge of nationalism and confidence that helped unify disparate regions of the young United States. This unity, however, was fragile, built on complex and sometimes contradictory ideals. It helped dissolve old political alignments, such as the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and was seen as unpatriotic after the Hartford Convention. Meanwhile, in Canada, the aftermath of the war reinforced a sense of distinct identity and loyalty to Britain. The successful defense against American invasions was celebrated as a birth of Canadian nationalism, even if the borders remained unchanged. The war confirmed the British commitment to North America and the viability of a Canadian nation within the Empire's framework. In the grand tapestry of history, the War of 1812 serves as a mirror, reflecting early 19th century tensions, imperial rivalry, national ambitions, and the struggle for identity. It was a war fought in shadows, often overshadowed by larger conflicts, but no less significant for those who lived through it. The Battle of New Orleans, with all its drama and irony, encapsulates the war's contradictions: victory amid stalemate, hope amid loss, and myth amid reality. As we consider these layers, I'm reminded how much the stories we tell about history shape our understanding of ourselves. The War of 1812 may not have redrawn maps, but it helped redraw the lines of national identity, memory, and myth. It teaches us about resilience, the complexity of alliances, and the costs that come with both war and peace. The quiet Mississippi night that witnessed cannon fire and courage still speaks to us across the centuries. It invites us to listen closely, not just to the roar of battle, but to the whispers of those whose lives were forever changed by this conflict. Soldiers, leaders, indigenous warriors, and civilians caught between worlds. In that sense, the War of 1812 is far from forgotten. It lives in the stories we tell, the flags we raise, and the questions we keep asking about who we are and where we come from. The echoes of New Orleans remind us that history is not just about dates and treaties, but about the human spirit navigating the uncertain tides of time. The winter air hung heavy with a quiet tension as 1815 unfolded, the bitter chill of January settling over the Mississippi's muddy banks, where a clash unlike any other was about to take place. Though the Treaty of Ghent had been signed weeks earlier in Europe, news travelled slowly across the vast distances, and the guns had not yet fallen silent. Here, in the deep south, the fate of a nation was still being written in the soil beneath weary feet and the thunder of cannon fire. Andrew Jackson, a man forged in the fires of frontier skirmishes and shaped by a fierce will to protect his homeland, stood at the helm of an unlikely force. His army was a mosaic of veterans, frontiersmen, freedmen, native allies, and even pirates, men bound not by uniform, but by a shared determination to hold the line. Jackson's command was as unconventional as the battle itself, yet his leadership would become the stuff of legend, reverberating far beyond the quiet waters of the Mississippi. The British troops, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars and seasoned soldiers, had expected an easy victory as they approached New Orleans. They were confident, disciplined, and well-equipped, yet they underestimated the terrain, the resolve of the defenders, and perhaps most of all, the unpredictability of the man who led them. The swampy earth, thick with bayous and dense foliage, became a natural fortress, one that Jackson and his men knew intimately. In the early days of January, the British began their advance. Their strategy was straightforward: seize New Orleans, control the Mississippi, and cut off American expansion westward. But Jackson's forces had prepared well. They dug trenches, fortified earthworks, and placed artillery in commanding positions that overlooked the marshes and floodplains. The defenders moved with a quiet urgency, their every action informed by a deep understanding of both the land and the stakes. On the morning of January 8th, 1815, the battle erupted in a sudden, fierce storm of musket fire and cannon blasts. The British charged across the open ground, only to be met by withering volleys and artillery shells that tore through their ranks. Despite their training and numbers, the attackers found themselves bogged down in mud and confusion, while Jackson's men held steady with calm precision. The fighting was brutal and relentless, but as the sun dipped low, the British assault faltered. Casualties mounted, and with their lines broken, the soldiers retreated, leaving the field to the ragged but resolute defenders. The victory was decisive, unexpected, and resounding, a triumph that sent ripples of hope and pride across a young nation still finding its feet. What is remarkable, perhaps even quietly poetic, about the Battle of New Orleans is that it was fought after the peace treaty had already been signed, though not yet ratified. The delay in communication meant that the war had technically ended, but the battle served as a final punctuation mark, a dramatic and symbolic close to years of conflict. For many Americans, it was a cause for celebration, proof that their nation could stand firm against the world's most powerful empire. Jackson himself emerged from the battle a national hero, his reputation cemented by tales of courage and tenacity. His leadership style, rough-edged yet effective, captured the imagination of a country eager for heroes. As historians reflect, his victory helped reshape the narrative of the war, transforming it from a frustrating stalemate into a story of resilience and triumph. But the true legacy of the War of 1812 is far more nuanced and complex than any single battle or personality. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24th, 1814, essentially restored the status quo ante bellum, meaning that borders remained unchanged, and none of the territorial disputes that sparked the war were directly resolved. It was a treaty born of exhaustion, diplomacy, and mutual recognition that neither side could claim an outright victory. Yet beneath the formal terms lay profound shifts in identity and destiny. In the United States, the war stirred a surge of nationalism. The nation, having withstood invasion and internal division, emerged with a stronger sense of self and purpose. The Federalist Party, weakened by its opposition to the war and the controversial Hartford Convention, began to fade from political relevance. The era of good feelings was on the horizon, marked by a new spirit of unity and ambition. For Canada, the war became a defining moment of survival and identity. British and Canadian forces, along with their indigenous allies, had successfully repelled American invasions, fostering a sense of pride and loyalty that would contribute to the shaping of a distinct Canadian nationhood. The conflict reinforced ties to the British Crown and the shared narrative of defence against external threats. But the war's consequences for Indigenous peoples were deeply tragic. Their hopes for a sovereign confederacy, championed by leaders like Tecumseh, were dashed. The death of Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames and the weakening of British support left native nations vulnerable to expanding American settlement. The war marked a turning point in the loss of Indigenous autonomy and land across North America, setting the stage for decades of displacement and struggle. As I reflect on this conflict, what strikes me most is how it encapsulates the messy, often contradictory nature of history. It was a war without a clear victor, fought over questions that remained unresolved. Yet, it changed the course of nations, influenced identities, and echoed in the stories told around hearths and taverns long after the guns fell silent. In many ways, the War of 1812 was not just a military contest, but a battle over the meaning of nationhood itself, what it meant to be American, Canadian, or Indigenous in a rapidly changing world. It showed that even when battles end in stalemate, the forces unleashed can shape the future in unpredictable and lasting ways. Tonight, as you listen in the quiet, perhaps you can imagine the distant thunder of those cannon, the flickering flames of campfires along the Mississippi, and the steady resolve of people caught in the sweep of history. The War of 1812 may be often overlooked, but its lessons remain, whispering through time about courage, resilience, and the fragile, enduring hope for peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this story as intriguing and soothing as I hoped, please consider liking and subscribing to keep these late-night tales coming. Until next time, rest well and good night.